These vests serve to protect and clearly identify journalists, yet they've offered little protection for Palestinian journalists who risk their lives to report on Israel's relentless bombing of Gaza.
Back into Gaza. Do you know anything about that?
On the first day of the war, October 7th, this happened. A bomb went off near Al Jazeera reporter Yumna Al-Sayed as she reported live in Gaza City, and the building behind her, home to several media institutions. It was a sign of things to come. Just 2 days later, this would become the final broadcast from journalist Saeed Al-Tawil.
للأسف تم تحذير برج حجي بالقصف.
The editor-in-chief of a news website, along with 2 other journalists, stood at a safe distance from a building Israel warned it would bomb. Instead, it struck a building nearby, killing all 3. While international media have only been allowed in with the Israeli army under heavy censorship, journalists in Gaza have been pivotal in documenting and exposing possible Israeli war crimes and the suffering of Palestinians. Among them is Al Jazeera's former Gaza bureau chief Wael al-Dahdo, who continued in his pursuit to report on the war, even after his wife, teenage son, 7-year-old daughter and his grandson were killed in an airstrike. In mid-December, he and Al Jazeera cameraman Samer Abu Daqqa were caught in a strike while filming at a school. While Abu Daqqa was wounded and still under heavy fire, a network of human rights groups and journalists pressured Israel to let them rescue him. Arriving 6.5 hours later, it was too late. Abu Daqqa had bled to death. Dahdo was injured in the same strike. Less than a month later, Dahdo's oldest son Hamza travelled to southern Gaza to document the aftermath of an Israeli attack, but never returned. A direct strike on his vehicle killed him and his colleague Mustafa Thoraya. Wael al-Dahdo paid tribute to his 27-year-old son. For much of the war, Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail Al-Ghul was reporting from northern Gaza. He and his cameraman Rami Al-Rafi were directly targeted in an Israeli strike on his car. Both were wearing press vests. These are just some of the stories of journalists who set out to tell the truth about Israel's war on Gaza. And these are the names of all the journalists killed while doing so. Those who died in the first few months of Israel's war on Gaza made up 75% of all journalists killed around the world in 2023. Last year, this reporter tore off his press vest after learning of his colleague's death, saying it offered no protection. And in Gaza, many people know that wearing a press vest can even make them a target. Yet, it's also come to symbolise the pursuit of truth in the face of death. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera.
Tim Dawson's the Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. He's joining us now from London. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. So far, 174 media workers in Gaza killed in the past year. That's at least that number so far. Of course, that number will have been going up. What's your reaction to those numbers?
It's beyond shocking. Watching that report really brings tears to my eyes, despite having followed this story very closely from the outset. The toll paid by journalists in Gaza is something really that humanity has no prior experience of. As your reporter said, well over 10% of all journalists in Gaza have lost their lives since this conflict began. The usual mortality rates expected of infantry soldiers is less than 5%. The number of US Marines who were killed in Vietnam was less than 5% of those deployed. So we're talking about absolutely shocking levels of loss of life. And really, perhaps even more remarkable than that tragedy is that so many journalists in Gaza have continued working, have continued despite the extraordinary privations they've suffered with little food, no shelter, no fuel, but they have continued to act as the eyes and ears of the world and brought out extraordinary and brilliant stories of the terrible destruction that's been wrought on their communities.
When we're live with our crews in Gaza in particular, we can often hear Israeli reconnaissance drones flying overhead. We heard it with Tariq al-Bawzoum when we were talking to him from Deir al-Balah just a few minutes ago. The Israeli military says it does not intentionally target or harm journalists. What's your reaction to that statement?
Well, we know that the Israeli Defense Force have some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment in the world. They're able to track people from mobile phones with minute precision. We know that they have some of the most precise geolocating technology, allowing them to know where people, the patterns of movement, where they go at night, whom they associate with. And we know that they have highly sophisticated AI-enhanced targeting equipment that allows drones to deliver death to street addresses pretty much in the way that Amazon delivers books and compact discs. When you take all of that technology and the extraordinary death toll that has been visited upon journalists in Gaza, as well as the orchestrated and campaign against any kind of reporting from the enclave, it's very hard not to conclude that these are deliberate actions. And I think what's most important now is for the International Criminal Court to intensify its investigation and really get to the bottom, because I think, in war, accusations fly about and half-truths and much evidence is buried beneath piles and piles of blown-up concrete. What we need now is judicial examination of the evidence that there is and a holding to account, where that's necessary, of those who've perpetrated war crimes.
Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, was telling us just a few moments ago as well that 226 UN workers are now known to have died. Of course, medical crews have been targeted in these conflicts as well. Do you think that the world has a different perception when it comes to the deaths of journalists as opposed to medical crews and aid workers?
All these deaths in Gaza, the vast bulk of which are women and children, whatever their occupations, are utterly, utterly tragic. Of course, those occupations that put themselves in the way of harm, as medical staff do, as relief staff do, as journalists do. Perhaps it seems like a greater tragedy. When medical staff lose their lives, of course, it affects the ability to provide healthcare within Gaza, and that is vitally, vitally important at this point. Where journalists lose their lives, it stops channels of information from getting out of Gaza. We know that great efforts have been made to keep international journalists from the enclave. We know that lots of hurdles have been put in the way of free and fair reporting of what's happening in Gaza. So, as well as the human tragedies of journalists losing their lives while simply trying to do their job, there is the tragedy for the rest of the world, that it's harder for us to understand what's happening there, that the truths that are happening on Gaza streets every day are being kept from the world. So one life is not greater or more important than another, but the impact on the rest of humanity and our ability to know is greater when journalists lose their lives.
Tim Dawson is Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists, so we appreciate it.